Well, thank you very much for that, Sonny. As I pointed out earlier, this is my first time preaching, so the prayers are really a very important part of that preparation, probably more important than anything I've done because I'm still trying to get used to this. And I do actually have a job that involves public speaking, but I don't normally see the people that I'm speaking to. It might be about this many people, but it's very short. I don't have to try and follow notes like this. I just say, ladies and gentlemen, we'll shortly be landing in Dubai. It's 35 degrees. Thank you for choosing to fly. And they don't want to hear from me. They're trying to watch a movie. So this is a little bit different and something I'm trying to get used to. So I really appreciate those prayers, and hopefully you will hear the Lord speaking today. Yeah. So today we are doing the last of the I Am series, our summer series of all the statements Jesus made in the Gospel of John, where he says, I am something. Today we are doing I am the vine. But I want to just set the context before I read the passage. The Gospel of John, where we find these statements, is really heavily focused on kind of proving to people who are probably already Jewish that Jesus is the Messiah they've been waiting for. This passage is in chapter 15, if you want to turn to it while I'm talking, starting at verse 1. And actually from chapter 12 of John's Gospel, it's really focused on this last week before Jesus is crucified. It's really heavily focused on the teachings that Jesus gives to those closest to him, his disciples, in these last few days of his sort of first life, if you will. And this particular passage is after even the Last Supper. He's had that famous meal where he washed the disciples' feet. And Judas has left. So at this point, there's even only 11 disciples because Judas has gone off with his plans to betray Jesus that night. Chapter 14 ends with, come now, let us leave. So they had probably left the room where they had dinner. Maybe they got up but didn't go anywhere, but they'd probably left that room, and maybe they're on their way to the Garden of Gethsemane where we know Jesus stopped to pray. Maybe they're walking past a vineyard, and that's what brought this to mind. Maybe they're going past the temple where there was a golden moulding of a vine with its grapes. We don't really know, but what I think is important is that we know where this is happening and who he's speaking to, right? He has done this teaching at the Last Supper. He's predicted his death. He's predicted his betrayal. And that's where he says to his disciples this passage. I'll read from chapter 15, verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command. Love each other. So, given this is talking about a vine and pruning and bearing fruit, I thought we should start with a bit about gardening. When we started this I Am series, the first preach was from Aloysia, who said, these are everyday things we hear, the bread of life. And I'm sure you all know what bread is, but you might not know much about vines or vineyards or pruning. So I actually like gardening, but I don't pretend to have any vines. I don't grow grapes. I have just some frangipani trees particularly. But I've got a few photos here of a vineyard. This is a vineyard sort of growing in summer and blooming. And then there's also the vineyard there in like a prune season, lying dormant in winter, recovering for the next season. Carefully grown in lines. But you can see that all the vines on the sort of dead-looking picture, they've actually been pruned. They've produced their fruit for one season, and then they get pruned. As the next slide will show, someone comes along and delicately prunes the vine. Now, this is something done carefully and skillfully. You might have seen people trimming a hedge in Dubai, where you've got the big hedge and they're trying to just cut it down, and they come along with almost like a chainsaw sort of thing, and it just takes everything off. That's not what's happening in pruning. These guys know exactly where and how to cut the vine to get the most fruit out of it for the next season, so it will flourish like that picture with all the green leaves all over it. And in the passage, this is what God is compared to. He's the gardener, the vine dresser. He comes and trims the vine. So, these might not look like your typical picture of God, the guy with the big white beard, but, in this story, this is what God's doing. He's coming along carefully pruning the vine. Now, this is what the pruned vine looks like. And you can see there's the old part of the vine is the dark brown, and then you can see in that side picture, there's the little stumpy branches that are there for the new growth. That old vine goes from year to year, and it stays there, and it's all the branches that get cut back to produce the new fruit. And a really well-established old vine is very valuable because it's known for producing good fruit, right? So that is what Jesus is likening himself to in this parable, that established tree, the good tree that we want to be attached to. Now, to bring this a little bit more into what you might see in your garden, I don't know if any of you like gardening. This is kind of what my garden looks like, and these are some of my frangipanis. You can see on your left that that's a tree that's growing nicely and making my garden look green. The one in the middle, you can see I've cut that tree because it was going over the fence into the neighbours. Might have got out of control. But after you prune any plant, even these don't produce fruit, but you prune the plant and then you see it's got that new growth. That's what's on that side. That's a couple of weeks later, you've got all these new leaves. And that's how they produce good fruit, new fruit out of a vine. By pruning it, you encourage that new growth. So that's kind of the basis for this whole gardening idea and producing new fruit by pruning. So, back into the passage. Jesus says here, I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. Why does he say the true vine? Well, as Pete mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the first miracle that Jesus did, certainly the first in John's Gospel, was turning water into wine at that wedding banquet, right? So there is a bit of a parallel here. But this is not just about Jesus producing wine for a wedding banquet. There is a much stronger repetition through the Old Testament of Israel being the vine that God prepared and cared for. There's a few passages listed there. Psalm 80 says the vine was transplanted from Egypt, but it goes to ruin. Isaiah 27, it was a pleasant vineyard, the Lord its keeper, to fill the world with its fruit. But Jeremiah 2 mentions the choice vine turned against the Lord and became wild. I'm sort of editing that bit to make the point. But Isaiah 5, I've got a longer bit which is on the screen. I won't read it all, but I'll pick out a few bits of it. He dug and cleared it of stones. He planted it with choice vines. Verse 4, what more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? It's not producing good fruit. And in verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, right? Israel was his vineyard. But the Lord looked for justice, behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, an outcry. You see, God brought Israel out of Egypt, but it was not his true vine. It didn't produce what he wanted. They were kind of following their own agenda. And in fact, they even rejected God as their king, right? They were ruled by judges and prophets for a while in the book Judges, but then come into Samuel and the people are crying out for a king. 1 Samuel 8, and the Lord told him, Samuel, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Right? They had seen all the other nations around them had kings, sort of warrior kings, and that's what Israel wanted. They weren't content with being under the leadership of a prophet, one of God's anointed leaders. They wanted their own sort of earthly king. So we shouldn't be surprised, really. That's in our nature, isn't it? Our human, fallen, sinful nature to do what we want, to see other people and want what they have. But here Jesus is now replacing Israel as the true vine. Jesus will produce good fruit. We know that a good tree will produce good fruit. And that's why Jesus is the true vine. This is the good tree that will produce good fruit. Just as Israel's fruit turned out wild grapes, Jesus produced the most choice wine at that wedding banquet. That is the produce we can get from being attached to the true vine. It also describes God in verse 1 as the gardener or the vine dresser. All right, the purpose of tending the vines, as I said, is to get the most out of the vine. It's careful, it's coming along and trying to get the most out of that tree. Now in verse 2, where it says the branches are pruned, it might have a note in your Bible that says down the bottom, this word sort of also means cleans. And it's very similar to the word they use in verse 3, where it says, you are already cleaned. So it's sort of the same base word in Greek, but pretty well all the translations actually go with that combination, saying pruning and then cleaning. But regardless of the specifics of how it might be translated, the idea either way is to get the most out of that bit of fruit. Right? The fruit might be cleaned if it's dragging in the dirt and it might go rotten. So you might lift it up, clean it and hang it back on the vine where it's going to produce more fruit. The same idea with the pruning, right? It's pruned to produce more fruit. And so that is God's purpose when he comes to prune. And even in the passages from the Old Testament, we see that he was tending his vineyard. Right? This was God's vineyard he was looking after, trying to produce fruit in that world. But part of pruning here also leads into branches that are cut off, taken away. And this also is repeated in verse 6. They're thrown away withers into the fire. And you start to think, oh, gee, we're going to have to produce fruit to please God. But that is not the point I want to make. That would actually be a bit of a misreading. The point here is if you are in the good vine, in a good tree, you will produce good fruit. And so this is the first real point I want to make. Remain in Jesus. Right? Your Bible might have a slightly different translation, abide, but you will see either that word remain or abide comes up over and over and over and over and over again. If you were reading abide, you're thinking, what is abide? It keeps coming up, right? It's repeated so often. Jesus is really hammering this point home, isn't he? Remain in me, because I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. This is the point, and he hammers it home again and again. Be in him. Just as any branch on a tree gets its life from the root, the trunk, that old part of the vine you saw in those pictures, that's there, and that provides all the sustenance a branch needs to grow. If you cut that off, you cut off the sap. It's like cutting off your arm, you don't get blood to it. You must remain attached to your life source. And our life source, our inspiration, our reason for being, our purpose must be Jesus. And we must remain in him. Now you might think, back to the audience he's talking to here, this is slightly odd, right? These guys have been with Jesus for 3 years, wandering around. They have stuck by him. Why is he really pushing this point here to these guys? Remain in me, remain in me, remain in me. Well, there is a bit of a history of people not remaining in God, isn't there? Even with Jesus, in John chapter 6, after he talked about being the bread of life, some people didn't like that, the idea of eating Jesus. They thought that was weird, and a lot of people started to leave him. John 6:66. After this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Right? He has seen people kind of follow him and then think, not sure about this anymore. And they've left him. If you go back further, in the Old Testament, we think about Israel. How much did God do for the Israelites, bringing them out of Egypt, feeding them in the desert when they had no food, rescuing them from the Egyptians that came chasing after them? And yet Moses goes up the mountain for a couple of days. They make a golden calf. They've abandoned him again. Right? This is not new. At this time, Judas has just gone off to betray Jesus for a few pieces of silver. He is used to people not hanging around. When something else comes, it's easy to be distracted. And Jesus taught, this is not the first time he's taught this theme. Think about the parable of the sower, where the seed is scattered into 4 different fields. And in one, it shoots up, but it's rocky ground, so it withers because it has no deep roots. In another, it grows up amongst thorns, which then strangle it. Only one field does that seed go on to produce a crop. Also in Matthew 7, a wise man builds his house on the rock so that when the storms come, it will remain firm. Not if the storms come, when they come. We should expect difficulties, right? It's not easy following Jesus, and his life is the example. He is about to be crucified. Now, if you've got one of these Bibles, paper, you might see some of the other subheadings around this chapter. You might not see that if you've got the WhatsApp version or with Instagram. But if you've got a couple of pages either side, you'll see some of the trials and tribulations, right? The next subheading I've got is the world hates the disciples. And Jesus goes on to caution that we should expect that. This is probably why he's emphasizing, remain in me and you will produce fruit. Remain in me and you will produce fruit. We probably know that this can be hard, right? And I think in our life, we see probably 2 main reasons why this is hard. One, I think, is distractions. And another is you might have another purpose or identity. Right? When you wake up in the morning, I know for me, it's normally the alarm clock is going off on my phone. I pick up my phone and there's a whole handful of distractions right there, isn't there? Do I turn to God first thing in the morning? Or do I check my WhatsApp, check my email, I check the news, you might check Facebook if you're old like me, Instagram, or TikTok, whatever you're into. Or is Jesus the first thing in your morning? I know I find that hard, right? Recently, I deleted Twitter. I thought, I'm wasting time here. I'm spending more time there than I am with God. So I deleted that app. That was one way out. But we all have lots of other distractions. You follow a football team, and is that really important to you? You're staying up late, getting up, watching the games. That might not bring much joy in your life if you're like me recently. Depends on the season, right? But these distractions in themselves are not bad, but are they actually taking you away from God? Are you being rooted in the true vine? Because these things are not producing fruit, are they? And our purpose is to be fruitful, to bring glory to God. Also, you might have a different purpose, right? Is your identity, your position at work, the job you do, the title you have, is that your purpose or identity? Is it being fit and healthy and you're out there in the gym all the time and people know you as the fit person that does triathlons or Ironmans or whatever? Is that your identity? Again, these things are not bad, but are they actually fruitful? This is what we have to remember. Are they fruitful and are they our real source of life? Is this what God wants from you? Now, I quite like coffee, and I would have to say that I'm addicted because I'm not having like 10 cups a day. Every day I would have at least 2 cups. And if I don't have a coffee for a day, I start to feel it, right? A lot of you might have your coffee in the morning and you think you need it to get going. But where you become addicted is if you don't have it, then you might start to get a headache and you're like, something's wrong. Your body knows that you're missing something that you normally rely on, right? That's obviously more severe with other substances that you can be addicted to. But I know I get that headache if I don't have my coffee. Are you addicted to Jesus like you are addicted to your coffee? Because we need to be tapped in. If you don't have Jesus for a day, you don't spend time in the Word, praying to Him, sitting under Him, are you feeling that twinge, that headache? Are you feeling like you're missing out? That is how we need to be attached to Him. Louis Armstrong, the famous musician, trumpeter, I won't try to sing, he said, if I don't practice for one day, I notice. If I don't practice for 2 days, other people, the critics, will notice. That's what we need to be like with our time with God and being rooted in Jesus, being rooted in the Word. You will notice if you're not spending that time with Him. And maybe you're not going to be as fruitful. Other people will start to notice as well if you're not staying rooted in Him, attached to that vine. Is that where you're getting your life from every day? Other people will notice and you'll feel worse for it. You'll feel further from God if you're not spending that time with Him every day. Just like a musician notices if they don't practice. Now, I'm not pretending I can tell you how you can do that best each day. You're going to have to work that out. Maybe talk about it in your city groups. So other people might have a suggestion if that's something you struggle with. If you're not in a city group, you might want to get in a city group. That might help you. All these notices today were kind of about this. Come to the prayer meeting midweek. That will help you focus and spend time with God if you're struggling to do it on your own. Get involved in the prayer and fasting. Come to the conference, right? That's a whole weekend of being here, being immersed in God and in His Word, right? These kind of opportunities, even the mission trip, what a great opportunity. I know when I've done these sorts of things, you really feel far more rooted and encouraged in God, right? And you notice going out from that how invigorating that is. So this main point, remain in Jesus. This is our source of life. and we will be fruitful. And that brings me to pruning. This is how we become fruitful. If we're a branch and we are attached to Jesus as our life source, we should expect pruning. Now, this might not be something we necessarily look forward to. It might not be something we enjoy. It might take many different forms, and maybe it is something that's good for you. Now, back to the gardening, the picture on that side shows, you can see probably a long branch that doesn't really have much leaf or fruit, perhaps, on it. So that's where it would be cut back to produce more, right? The middle picture, you can see there's sort of a trunk growing up, and then branches. It's a bit harder to see, I know, but there's branches going off to the side, like it's had to grow out in a different direction. And then you've got the vineyard picture over there, which shows how a vine would look pruned to produce more grapes. What you will see in that picture is that every branch has been pruned. This kind of goes back to that, verse 2 about a branch might be cut off and thrown away. Every branch will be pruned. So we must expect pruning. But the purpose of the pruning is more fruit. Now, that pruning in your life might be coming to church today, hearing from a friend. They might have an encouraging word for you. Maybe you'll find the preach encouraging. Maybe you listen to a podcast that was encouraging. Maybe in your quiet time, you'll read something in the Bible that prunes you and challenges you. Maybe a friend will come up to you and challenge you on how you're living, what you're doing. But we must remember that when God prunes us, He knows what we need, not what we want. Now, think about the guys in the Bible who brought their paralyzed friend on a mat and lowered him through the roof of a house, right? So crowded they couldn't get in the door. Through the roof, they've lowered him on the mat. They wanted him to be healed. They didn't want to carry him home again. But Jesus forgave his sins because that's what he needed. Might not be what they wanted, but it's what he needed. And we need to remember that. Now, okay, he did get healed and they didn't have to carry him home. So win-win all around. Again, a life event might be a pruning, right? That guy was healed and that could produce fruitfulness for God. This is the purpose. The pruning should lead to fruitfulness. Maybe you came to Dubai to be fruitful here. Maybe that was a good thing for you. But at the same time, we all know we'll have to leave Dubai one day. That might not happen at a time of your choosing. I know a lot of people might ask me, how long are you going to be here for? Is that really a time of my choosing? Or is this something that God might be pruning? Maybe coming here was pruning. Maybe leaving here is pruning. Some of these events will be hard. It might not be easy, but we need to look for fruitfulness in it. And we should remember that God is the vine dresser here, and He has been pruning throughout history. You can probably think of a few people in the Bible whose lives were changed, sent in a different direction by God, because this is a story of God and His people. If we start at the beginning, because I'm pretty simple, Genesis chapter 6, we come to Noah, and he was told to build a boat. That was probably quite confusing, but he listened to God, right? He listened to God, and he did what he was instructed and built a boat. And that was a blessing for his family, for all the animals he saved, and for generations. We get to Abraham, still in Genesis. He had to leave his family and his land, and he went out and started a new life, and then almost sacrificed his son because he was listening to God. He was being pruned, but that again produced fruitfulness for God. That rose up the Israelites. And then this is one of those more difficult times. Not so much a word from God, but think about Joseph, still only in Genesis, where he was sold by his brothers to be a slave. There he was, thought he was the chosen one in the family, but actually he gets beaten up and sold off, becomes a slave. More so in Egypt, he ends up in jail. But didn't those events lead to blessing and fruitfulness? Right? He blessed his family when they came to Egypt. And then also God was able to rescue the Israelites from Egypt generations later. I think this tells us that we might not see the blessing or the fruitfulness that comes from our pruning. It might not be what we expect. You might not be able to see it. Think how many countries would have had missionaries go and struggle and toil, and yet generations later there might be a thriving church because of those people who did it hard and struggled. One thing that's important from this in the pruning is our response. A screenwriter, not a Christian, Robert McKee says, "True character is revealed in the choices a human makes under pressure." How do we respond when we are pruned? This, I think, is quite important. If you think about the branch that's on the vine before it's pruned, I'm going out on a bit of a limb here, but stick with me. The branch gets cut. If we think about that sort of comment in verse 2 about some are cut and removed and some produce fruit, that is the spot where we have to respond to God. When we face pruning, do we remain attached to Him as that part of the branch and produce fruit? Or do we find it difficult and remove ourselves from Him? Verse 6 says, "If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers." We have no life apart from Him. Pruning might not be easy. It might not be what we've chosen. Probably not what you're hoping for. But how we respond to that pruning is what reveals our character. And that's when we must lean on Jesus. That's when we must lean on Jesus and get our life from Him and our purpose from Him. We cannot produce fruit on our own, only through Him. So what is fruit? Now, if we talk about actual fruits, like the grapes on the vine or an apple on the tree, the fruit does not bless the tree itself, does it? It is eaten by other animals or it is picked and taken away. It does not bless the tree itself. So you should not expect a blessing from the fruit you produce, right? You are producing fruit, and that will quite likely bless others more than yourself. But verse 8 says, "This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." We are to bear fruit to bring glory to God. Also, one other thing about an actual fruit is, how do you tell a fruit from a vegetable? Right? This sometimes comes up in our house around dinner. Is this a fruit? Is this a vegetable? Right? Who knows? How do you tell? What's sort of a characteristic of a fruit? Seeds, right? Seeds. A fruit has seeds on the inside. I think that's right. So is a tomato a fruit? Is a cucumber a fruit? Is a capsicum? I mean, this might get confusing. It might blow you mind, right? But part of the purpose, the idea here is that the seeds in a fruit will go on and on. So again, the blessing might not be for you. It might go on and on. That is why we're called to produce fruit, so that God will be glorified, so that His blessing will be abundant. It will go on and on. And Jesus gives an example here of how we should be producing fruit. Verse 13, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Remember, Jesus has not yet died, right? This is before he's been captured by the authorities. So this might sound a little bit strange to his followers that he's saying, greater love than, etc., lay down one's life. Well, he's about to do it. He's about to show them his love for them. And he goes on and on in the second half of that passage about remaining in God's love. He remained in the Father's love. We should remain in his love, and we should love others. That is his command, that we should love others. And that is how we can bear fruit. You possibly also thought of the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5, and so did I. Verse 16, so I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Really, all these things are coming out of love, aren't they? Bearing with another, being faithful, being gentle. This is loving other people. Jesus gave this example in his life. He hung out with the persecuted, the ostracized, the tax collectors. Nobody liked them, but he laid down his life, not concerned for his own reputation. He loved the people that society might not have loved. And he loved us. He died for us. This is the example we have from him. And we're to love our neighbours. John 15, again in our passage, verse 12, Jesus commands us to love one another as he loved us. And even just before that passage in Galatians, Paul writes, the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbour as yourself. So we must love one another. That brings us on to friendship. You might have noticed there, Jesus wants to stress, we are not his servants, we are his friends. What an astounding statement from the Lord of the universe. He wants to be your friend. Verse 14, you are my friends if you do what I command. Now that sounds a little bit odd, right? For a friendship, you must do what I tell you to do. That's not a great friend. I'm sure if you hung out with someone that just bossed you around, you wouldn't consider that very friendly. But again, if I trust the Greek commentary on this, not that I read Greek, what people say the Greek means, it's more like a king and his inner circle, right? His confidence around a king, and that sort of friendship relationship. And he is our king, undoubtedly. And we are like that inner circle of friends, and we would do what the king commands. And we would probably also be, therefore, aligned with what he wants. Where we see that he says, ask in my name, whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. If we are one of his inner confidants and we have his interests, his kingdom in our heart, and we are attached to that, we will be asking what he wants. This is the sort of friendship he wants from us. But what is really amazing here, if you don't know Jesus, this is a demonstration that he explains of how much he wants to be your friend, that he would lay down his life for you. This is not like other gods, other religions, other spiritualities that might say, do this, do this, do this. Don't do that. On some days, do this. That's not the relationship God wants with us. Not what Jesus demonstrates. He wants us to be his friend. He wants a relationship with us. He laid down his life to demonstrate how much he wants a relationship with us. You can also think of the story in Luke 10 where Jesus went to visit Martha and Mary. And Martha's running around tidying the house, but Mary sits at his feet. And Jesus says to Martha, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion. Jesus wants us to sit at his feet. He wants us to be with him. This is how we will produce fruit. We can't earn his favour by going around doing chores, by doing these things. We must be in him. It comes back to remain in Jesus. One thing I love about going to work, and this might sound a little strange, is coming home from work. Because if I come home from work at a good time of day when my kids are awake, when I open the door, invariably one of them, at least, will run up to me and give me a great big hug. I don't know if there are other parents in the room that get that as well. That is a highlight of my day. Your children running to you to embrace you, and that is what God the Father wants from us. He doesn't want us to be running around trying to produce our own fruit, because you know that a branch trying to produce its own fruit will produce nothing if it is not attached to the tree. We must be attached to our vine, Jesus, to produce good fruit, just like that. One part of this that I would like to finish with a quote from C.S. Lewis that kind of brings us together, the pruning, remaining in him. If you imagine yourself as a living house, God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, you can understand what he is doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof, and so on. You knew these jobs needed doing, so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he's building quite a different house from the one you thought of. He's throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were going to be made into a decent little cottage, but he's building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. Let's make sure we are open to the plans he has for us. We are ready for pruning, even when it's hard. And let's respond to that pruning by remaining in him. We are going to have a time of communion now where we can really see that metaphor again of having Jesus in us, in the bread and the wine. And I would love to have a time of ministry where if you need prayer, if you've been struggling with the pruning that might be going on in your life, you might be in a hard season and you're finding that tough. Or you might not know much about Jesus. You might be visiting, wondering what this is really all about. We would love to pray for you and help you to know him better. We would love for you to tap into that vine. But we're going to have that time. Can I lead in communion? So we're going to go into this time of communion now. I would like to ask you all to come forward. We've got bread and grape juice here. If you'd like to leave your seats, come and gather around. Stand together as a family as we share Jesus' blood and his body as a reminder. So come and grab a piece of bread and a cup of juice. Thank you. And as you come forward to get your bread and your juice, maybe think about, have you been remaining in Jesus? Have you been leaning on him when you need to make a decision? When you face something tough, do you lean on him for your strength? Are you facing challenges at the moment? you need to throw it on Him. You need to lean on Him in these times. So if you've got a small group around you, look at each other and take that piece of bread. This is Jesus' body we are remembering. He shed His body for us. His body was torn upon that cross, and He did it for us. Let's take that piece of bread and eat it, remembering He shed His life for us, and be thankful. Let's take the juice, brothers and sisters. Let's remember this was Jesus' blood spilled on the cross. Not because of anything we had done to deserve it, but He took the punishment we deserved and shed His blood for us so that we can know Him, so that we can be washed clean in Him. Jesus, thank You for the blood You shed. Let's take and drink. Let's take this opportunity to worship Him. And if you want prayer, please come to the front. But let's reflect on what He has done for us in this final time.